I want to talk about what's being sold to the public as Trump's 28-point peace plan for Ukraine. Because the more you look at this thing, the more you realize it's not a peace plan in any serious sense. It's a PR memo dressed up like diplomacy. Let me go through this clearly. First of all, there's a huge question mark over where this document even came from. It looks like it was cooked up through back channels involving people like Kirill Dmitriev, someone personally close to Putin, and Steve Witkoff, Trump's guy, during meetings in places like Miami. But here's the key point. It's not clear Dmitriev had any formal authority from the Kremlin to commit Russia to anything, or that Moscow was even fully aligned with what was written down. So right away, this plan has the smell of an amateur shortcut. And that's exactly what it reads like, amateur. It feels like a press release, not a treaty. It's vague in the crucial parts and full of contradictions. It follows the same Trump pattern we've seen elsewhere. Announce a peace, leave all the difficult substance for later, then claim victory in headlines. You get the illusion of resolution without the machinery of a real one. That's been his style in multiple theaters: India, Pakistan, Thailand, Cambodia, Rwanda, Congo, even Gaza. Big declarations, thin details. In reality, it's a proclamation of a fictitious peace. And you know what's even more revealing? This Ukraine plan parallels the Gaza peace plan almost line by line in logic. Why? Because in both cases, the people most affected weren't properly consulted. The Europeans now complain, how can you make a deal behind Ukraine's back? Well, that's exactly what was done to the Palestinians in Gaza. And I didn't hear Europe screaming about consultation back then. So yes, this double standard is loud. Now, a lot of Western voices are pushing the narrative that Ukraine is being asked to surrender everything while Russia gives up nothing. That's not true. Russia is being asked to freeze a military campaign it is clearly winning, to halt momentum it earned the hard way, on the promise of vague security architecture discussions later. In war, that's not a small ask. But Ukraine, let's be honest, Ukraine is being asked to accept reality. Territorially, what they're asked to give up is mostly the parts of Donetsk Russia hasn't fully taken yet, maybe 13, 14%. But every serious military observer can see what's happening. Ukraine's army is crumbling, the Russian advance is accelerating, and it's only a matter of time before Russia controls all of Donetsk anyway. So this plan isn't removing something Ukraine would keep. It's formalizing a battlefield trajectory that's already locked in. And the part that Ukraine keeps in Donetsk under this plan becomes a demilitarized zone, supervised internationally, to ensure Russia doesn't deploy weapons there. So again, the plan is basically admitting Russia's strategic inevitability while trying to wrap it in diplomatic paper. Then there's neutrality and NATO. Western media sells it like this is some shocking new concession. It's not. Russia recognized Ukraine's independence on the basis of a neutral Ukrainian constitution. Neutrality was the status quo ante. Returning to neutrality isn't a Russian gain, it's restoring the foundation that was deliberately broken over the last decade. Russia has said from day one it cannot tolerate NATO-aligned foreign forces planted next door with weapons aimed at Russian territory. That position never changed. The West ignored it. Now, reality is forcing them to revisit it. And let's be blunt, Ukraine was never going to get Article 5 protection. Europe and the US were willing to arm Ukrainians to bleed Russia, but they were never willing to fight Russia for Ukraine. So the idea that NATO membership was ever real was a fantasy sold to Kiev to keep the war going. What does Ukraine gain in this plan? Formal recognition of sovereignty and formal Russian recognition that Ukraine can pursue EU membership. Whether the EU actually allows that is between Brussels and Kyiv. But Russia putting that on paper is not nothing. It's effectively Moscow saying, we're not trying to erase Ukraine, we're trying to remove the threat and settle the core dispute. Now, the Europeans are outraged, talking about rewarding aggression. But here's the sharp truth. Europe has neither the money nor the will to stop Russia. They won't send troops. Even the British stabilization force idea collapses without U.S. backing, and Washington has made clear there will be none. Europe can't even agree on using seized Russian assets because they know that if they turn frozen reserves into war bonds, they risk detonating trust in the global financial system. Banks can't just steal customer money without consequences. Belgium and others are right to hesitate, and European rearmament itself is funded by debt because they don't have the revenue and they refuse to raise taxes to bankroll Ukraine. So it's surreal to watch Europe demand Russia's surrender while Europe itself is strategically empty-handed. It's posture without power, theater without leverage. There's also a clause wiping criminal liability for wartime human rights violations. That's controversial, sure, but you can't talk about accountability like it applies only to one side. War doesn't generate saints. And the bigger issue is still the same. None of these clauses matter if this plan doesn't have real official backing from the highest level on both sides. So what status does this document really have? We don't know. It doesn't look like Moscow formally authorized Dmitriev to sign anything. It doesn't look like the U.S. ran any serious policy process either. This is a Trump-style top-down improvisation. But here's the important part. Putin didn't reject it. He didn't accept it. He said it could be a basis for discussion. Why? Because for the first time in a long time, a Western proposal even touches the root causes Russia has declared since the beginning: NATO expansion, neutrality, demilitarization, and the rights of Russian speakers in Ukraine. Putin has always said negotiations are possible if those causes are recognized. He proved it in Istanbul in March, April 2022. The door was open. The West slammed it shut. So yes, this plan could become the basis of a broader mediation, maybe through China, maybe Turkey again, maybe Brazil, maybe a UN-anchored framework, but not as a unilateral decree. You don't end wars by ordaining terms like a landlord. You end them through buy-in. Ukraine, Russia, Europe, and the US all have to be in the room. And that's why Trump demanding signatures before Thanksgiving is absurd. It's arrogance. It's deadlines invented for headlines, not diplomacy. Now look at Zelensky's reaction. He says Ukraine faces a choice: accept the plan or lose U.S. support, endure a brutal winter, lose dignity. That's a man who knows the floor is collapsing under him. Ukrainian pride has been weaponized by Western rhetoric. He was led down a garden path, used as a tool to weaken Russia, and now he's being thrown away. And this is happening in the middle of a corruption crisis tied to his inner circle, stolen money, advisors fleeing, public anger exploding. He ran on peace, reversed it under Western pressure and ultranationalists, and now the limb he's standing on is being sawn off. There's a real chance he doesn't even remain in power long enough to sign anything. Meanwhile, the U.S. message is blunt: sign or lose intelligence and weapons. And Ukraine can't function without U.S. intelligence. Europe cannot replace that. So Zelensky's hard choice is real, but the best move for Ukraine is realism, not fantasy. And honestly, none of this chaos is about diplomacy. It's about battlefield panic. Russia is dictating reality on the ground. The West is scrambling to write a paper that catches up. That's the true order of events. Now, pivot to Gaza and Iran, because the parallels matter. Trump's approach there is the same. Impose, don't mediate; dictate, don't negotiate. Iran's foreign minister said it perfectly. They're ready for negotiation, not dictation. They reached understandings multiple times with Witkoff, then each time he came back to Washington, and the Zionist lobby rewrote the deal. That pattern has discredited the U.S. as a reliable negotiating partner. Iran says it's more prepared now than before, learned lessons, improved missile capability, strengthened cooperation with Russia. Nothing in that is surprising. If Israel resumes war, Iran won't limit itself only to military targets next time. Israel needed the ceasefire last round. Iran did not. That reality terrifies Tel Aviv far more than Western audiences understand. And there's another shift happening. Saudi Arabia is being treated more like Israel's equal in U.S. policy, now F-35 access included. That's new. It signals Washington quietly acknowledging the center of gravity in the region is not Israel alone anymore. Israel senses that drift. Israeli elites are even talking about self-reliance, cutting dependence on the U.S., which is ironic because their entire strategic ecosystem is built on U.S. sponsorship. So we're watching a slow separation. America and Israel diverging. America and Russia forced back into negotiation by Russian momentum. Europe exposed as loud but hollow. Ukraine collapsing under military, political, and moral exhaustion. That's the world right now. Russia, whether people like it or not, has been the only actor in this war whose stated objectives have remained consistent from day one. Remove NATO threat, secure Donbass, protect Russian speakers. Forced neutrality. The West called that impossible. Now they're writing a 28-point plan that circles back to those same foundations. Not because they agree with Moscow morally, but because Moscow's leverage made denial impossible. And that's the brutal truth behind the noise. The United States, under President Trump, is tightening the screws on Ukraine harder than ever, pushing Kiev toward a forced diplomatic settlement while leaving Europe completely out of the room. Europe is fuming. But the truth is, they have refused to acknowledge battlefield reality. And that's exactly where Trump is positioning himself. He's reacting not to speeches, not to narratives, but to the cold, hard facts emerging from the front lines. And those facts are brutal. Winter has arrived in Ukraine, collapsing anti-drone nets, exposing logistical routes, and showing in every way imaginable that the battlefield momentum belongs to Russia. Russian units are now appearing nearly 9 kilometers behind what used to be Ukrainian defensive lines in the southern axis. When forces push that deep, it means they're striking drone operators, artillery staging areas, and reserve positions simultaneously. The entire southern front is moving faster than at any time in the last 2 years, and for the linear warfare bros, these are the kinds of breakthroughs that signal systemic collapse, not temporary setbacks. The same story is repeating in the north, where front lines that hadn't budged in years are now shifting rapidly. Russian flags are going up across Yampil, Stavki, and Novosledivka, while gray zones evaporate and pressure builds towards Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, the true gateways to all of Donbass. Meanwhile, Kupiansk is falling apart, and Pokrovsk, despite Western maps pretending otherwise, is effectively under Russian control already. Ukraine is losing ground in multiple directions at once, and that is exactly what Western intelligence briefers tried to hide from Trump. Now add to that Ukraine's internal implosion, a desertion crisis, a manpower crisis, a demographic crisis, and a corruption catastrophe tied directly to Zelensky's closest circle. Billions have gone missing. Officials have fled. Western media, after 4 years of worshiping Zelensky, suddenly publishes headlines like "The Dark Side of Zelensky's Rule." That only happens when the West is preparing to abandon someone. So Trump's public pressure makes perfect sense. He's given Zelensky days, literally days, to accept the peace plan. Thursday is the deadline. And the key point is this: Trump isn't talking about Russia needing to accept anything. He speaks as if the United States and Russia already more or less understand each other, and the burden now falls entirely on Zelensky. A senior White House official even said Ukraine will have to accept a deal given Zelensky's weakness. Translation: he has no leverage left. Because if the United States withdraws support, the Ukrainian state collapses. Europe cannot replace American intelligence, American funding, American logistics, American weapons, or American energy support. Europe is struggling to fuel itself, let alone fuel someone else's war. Which brings us to the bigger picture. Washington is no longer thinking about Ukraine first, it is thinking about China. The true existential threat to the United States is Beijing's rise, not Russia. And Russia is one of China's most valuable partners: energy, agriculture, minerals, Arctic access, aerospace technology, electronic warfare, and a political backbone that refuses to bend. If Russia moves fully into China's orbit, America loses its last major lever to slow Beijing's growth. So from a purely strategic standpoint, it is far more valuable for the U.S. to cool tensions with Moscow than to continue bankrolling Ukraine's collapse. That is something Europe absolutely cannot comprehend. Putin, meanwhile, is practicing what I call poison pill diplomacy. The peace plan contains far more concessions from Ukraine than from Russia, yet it still represents a concession compared to Moscow's maximalist goals. So why entertain it? Because Putin knows Zelensky is almost certain to reject it. And that rejection will trigger exactly what Moscow wants: Washington stepping back, Europe panicking, Ukraine collapsing, and a new U.S.-Russia opening emerging quietly in the background. Zelensky's recent national address made it obvious he knows all of this. He spoke of Ukraine facing the hardest choice in its history, either losing dignity or losing its key partner, meaning the United States. He talks of dignified peace, a purposely vague phrase used when a nation is preparing its population for a painful loss. He talks of unity and pressure, meaning Washington is forcing his hand. He talks of sovereignty, meaning sovereignty is slipping away. And he talks about the enemy, meaning Russia, but completely ignores the internal betrayal and corruption that gutted his country from within. His message is clear. If Ukraine falls, he will blame Trump. And trust me, that will be the new Western narrative. We could have won if not for Trump. Meanwhile, Europe keeps shouting slogans but has no ability to act. They cannot raise taxes to fund Ukraine. They cannot send troops. They cannot provide the intelligence backbone. They cannot even agree to use frozen Russian assets. Their interest is ideological weakening Russia, not ensuring Ukraine's survival. But the U.S. interest is global slowing down China, and that requires rebalancing relations with Moscow, not burning the bridge entirely. So will Ukraine accept the deal? Zelensky might reject it publicly, but the battlefield will force acceptance either way. With U.S. support, Ukraine is already in catastrophic shape. Without U.S. support, it is game over. That's why this peace plan is strategically brilliant for Moscow. Either Zelensky signs or the war ends through collapse, and both outcomes favor Russia's long-term position. This upcoming week will be enormous. The battlefield is shifting rapidly. The Western narrative is cracking, and for the first time in years, Washington and Moscow may be quietly aligning not over Ukraine, but over China. That's the real story. Legends. Take care of yourselves. Big days are ahead. If President Zelensky rejects the peace deal proposed by President Trump, the consequences for Ukraine will be catastrophic, and the beneficiary will not be Kyiv or Washington, it will be Moscow. Ukraine's entire war effort has been artificially sustained by the United States, not by its own capabilities. Without American intelligence, ammunition, money, logistics, and political shielding, the Ukrainian state simply cannot stand. And whether people want to admit it or not, this war has already revealed a truth Moscow understood from the very beginning. Ukraine is not an independent actor. It survives only as long as the United States chooses to pay for its survival. That is why a rejection of the U.S. peace plan would not be an act of bravery, it would be an act of suicide. Washington is exhausted. Congress is fractured. The American public is no longer buying the fantasy that Ukraine can defeat Russia. And Trump, unlike the previous administration, does not believe in spending endless billions to prop up a government that is losing territory, losing soldiers, losing credibility, and losing the confidence of its own population. If Zelensky rejects the deal, the U.S. response will be subtle but devastating. Washington will not need to issue threats. All it needs to do is slow the oxygen. First comes a quiet reduction in intelligence sharing. Ukraine's ability to strike Russian positions already limited collapses overnight. Russia, whose military is now more experienced, better supplied, and advancing on multiple fronts, gains uncontested dominance. Without U.S. eyes in the sky, Ukraine becomes blind. Then weapons begin to dry up, not with speeches or ultimatums, but with delays. Artillery shells arrive late, ATACMs come in smaller numbers, air defenses don't get replenished on time. For an army that fires thousands of shells a day just to survive, even a small slowdown becomes fatal. Russia, with its enormous industrial base running at wartime tempo, will inevitably overwhelm Ukrainian positions. After that comes the financial suffocation. Ukraine's economy no longer functions. It exists almost entirely on Western subsidies. Pensions, government salaries, energy grid repairs, currency stability, all of it is paid for by the West. If the U.S. delays a single major disbursement, Ukraine faces immediate budget paralysis, IMF reviews slow down, World Bank support freezes, the hryvnia collapses, inflation spikes, and through it all, Russia stands untouched, increasingly insulated, and increasingly confident. But the most decisive blow will be political. The West's media machine, which has protected Zelensky for years, will flip the script instantly. Corruption stories, scandals, offshore accounts, mismanaged aid, golden toilets, everything they once ignored will become a weapon. They will portray Zelensky not as a hero, but as the man who rejected peace and doomed his own nation. And Russia will capitalize on this shift perfectly, presenting itself as the only rational actor, the only side seeking stability, the only side offering a way out. Without American backing, Zelensky will be politically finished. Ukraine's fractured elites, generals, oligarchs, ex-presidents will see that Washington has withdrawn its protection and will move against him. Russia will continue advancing, morale in Ukraine will collapse, conscription crackdowns will intensify, and the state will begin to fracture from within. Meanwhile, Moscow's position strengthens dramatically. A rejection of peace means Russia gains three strategic advantages at once. Continued military momentum allowing Russia to secure more territory in Donbass and potentially beyond. A divided and weakened West as Europe cannot replace the U.S. and cannot stop Russia's advance. A geopolitical realignment as Washington quietly shifts focus to China, leaving Russia freer than ever to dictate terms in Eastern Europe. In short, if Zelensky rejects the peace plan, Ukraine will face collapse militarily, economically, and politically, while Russia emerges stronger, more legitimate, and more strategically secure. The war will not end on Kiev's terms. It will end on Moscow's terms, and Moscow knows it. For Russia, this scenario is not a setback. It is a strategic victory unfolding exactly as the Kremlin forecast from the beginning.